Hello guys, and welcome to episode 3 of Learning Sim Racing, the YouTube series that is here to try and help you learn how to get the most performance out of the cars, improve your lap times, and improve your overall enjoyment of the sims that you like to run. I will be your host for the series Nightlock, and in episode 3, we are going to be looking at what is inarguably the two most important tools that you will have within any car you drive in any sim. Now, these two tools are going to be your feet. Throttle and brake control. Your control and technique with them is going to determine everything when you are actually out on track, from your pace to your consistency to how the car is responding to you mid-corner, on corner exit, on corner entry. Now, looking to the first part of this, throttle control. The first thing that you're going to experience anytime you get out on track, your throttle control is going to determine what kind of run you're able to get down a straight, how your car is going to react whenever you're exiting a corner. The biggest thing to remember with throttle control is you want to know when you need a smooth application versus a very sharp, very quick, very sudden application on corner exit. Now, what kind of throttle input you give is going to depend on the track, the corner, and the car that you're driving. If you are on a track such as Silverstone, coming out of Maggots and Beckett's in a car such as, say, a Mercedes AMG GT3 car, something that is front engine, rear wheel drive, you are going to want to have a very smooth throttle application. That way you can dial up onto the power and really start delivering it once you are moving out of the corner with little to no steering input available. You'll want to have this kind of throttle input with a combination like this because of the fact you have a majority of the weight over the front tires. You don't have much weight holding the rear tires of the car down to the road. So you're going to have less grip to work with, and a combination such like this could wind up resulting in you breaking the wheels free if you start suddenly punching and spiking your throttle input quite a bit. But if you do a slow roll onto the throttle and keep it smooth, you can start getting the power down and get the car up to speed to handle that power growth much better than you could if you just suddenly punched it. Now, if you're driving a mid or rear engine car, a great example is going to be the Porsche RSR. Most of the weight is going to be over those rear tires. It's going to have a lot more corner exit grip. Whenever you're going through a flowing corner such as Maggots and Beckett's, you're going to still want to be careful to use much smoother throttle input, but you can get away with possibly being a little harsher on the throttle depending on how you have the car set up. Where the real game changer comes in is going to be out of low speed, sharp corners where you're using little to no throttle input and getting the car turned and put back in a straight line very quickly. A good example of this would be the hairpin at the end of the back straight on the Hockenheim Ring, or the final turn at Laguna Seca. For turns like those, it's much easier for you to quickly get on the throttle in a car such as the RSR. Due to that weight being over the rear, you have a lot more grip, and with those turns, you should already pretty well be in a straight line before you're really dialing back onto the power, which means it's a lot easier for you to get on the power quickly without losing control of the cars if the wheels spin a little bit. Now, we've talked about the different kind of cars and different kind of corners and how they relate to the wheel spin that will come, but the key to good throttle control is learning to control that wheel spin. We'll get into the way that you'll control the balance of the car and how you can use it as an advantage going through the corners later on, but a quick look at controlling wheel spin. Obviously, wheel spin is not going to be good on track. It's going to cause you to burn through your tires quicker than you may want to. It'll cause excess heat to build up within the tires themselves, and it can also throw the car into a very uncontrollable state if you're not careful. Now, this may not be that bad in low-speed corners, but in high-speed corners, the wheel spin can cause your car to get some excess oversteer, which can lead you to either oversteering and spinning off the track, or getting snap oversteer when you try and correct, and then spinning off the track in the opposite direction. The big thing is you need to learn how to feel whenever the car begins to have wheel spin in a corner, and you need to be prepared to react accordingly. Now, I do say react accordingly because you need to react in proportion to the amount of wheel spin and slide that you're getting. It is possible to cause the car to go careening off track with sudden snap oversteer if you use too much countersteer trying to catch a slide. Now, if you feel the rear tires begin to spin up and a slide come on, you can let off the throttle to try and get the rear tires to grip back up and begin pushing the car through the corner instead of trying to push the car around, like is what happens whenever you begin to feel oversteer come on. The alternate option is when you begin to feel that wheel spin come on and the car does begin to slide, you can try and control the slide through the corner, generally by limiting throttle. At that point, you won't want to put any more extra input into it, as if you over throttle it, you can increase the amount of oversteer that you're getting and get the car to come around, but you want to balance your steering with throttle input to control the slide until you hit the end of the corner and can straighten the car up to go for corner exit. Now, moving on to braking. The most important part of brake control is going to be using a smooth application. The biggest issue that people come into when they're starting sim racing with your left foot generally is going to be dealing with brake lock. I've seen a lot of people that when they come up to a corner, they'll start to get nervous or they'll start to get excited, and you see them quickly and violently punch onto the brakes, and then that usual puff of smoke from the tires comes up and they either careen off or spin around on the corner. You want to use a smooth application of the brakes instead of a sudden punch. That way you are slowly increasing the pressure that you're using instead of suddenly punching it and causing the brakes to instantly lock. Using this smoother application also means you can get to the point where you can feel the brakes beginning to lock and let off. Now, if you do go onto the brakes and you feel your tires locking up, you will feel one of two things. If you have a more frontwards bias on your brakes, you'll feel the front tires lock and you'll lose all ability to steer the car. If you have a rearwards bias on your brakes, you'll feel the back tires lock and the car beginning to want to rotate around. Now, in both situations, it's going to be the same method to deal with them. You want to ease off of the brakes until you feel the locked up tires begin to free up and rotate once again. If it's a front end lockup, what that means is you're going to want to let off, straighten up your steering, and wait until you feel the tires begin to rotate again, and then try and turn into the corner without using quite as much pressure. The big trick you have to remember is the way a car is set up, your tires will only have a limited amount of grip. So if you are trying to brake and you have a much more frontward bias, your front tires in a straight line are getting the maximum amount of force that they can with the brakes. But then as soon as you turn the wheel, you're going to be taking some of that grip that the tires have and then expending it, trying to get the tires to turn and guide the car through the corner. So it's not going to have as much grip to be able to work and roll through the brakes, which can cause your tires to lock up. If you have a rearwards bias and you feel your rear tires locking up under heavy braking, you may feel the car begin to squirm very awkwardly or even try and spin around. As soon as you feel the car begin to squirm, you want to try and use a little bit of countersteer. Not a lot. At this point, it is very easy to cause the car to snap oversteer if you overcorrect, because the slide will generally be much more minor. But you want to then ease off the brakes using a little bit of countersteer to keep the car in a straight line. After a while, you'll begin to feel the rear tires rotate again and the car will settle down. The biggest thing to remember is if your rear brakes lock up, you do not want to turn in the direction that the car is trying to rotate. If you do that, you will encourage even more of that rotation and cause the car to spin. This is most prevalently seen whenever you see a driver go into a hard braking zone. A good example being turn 3 at the Red Bull Ring. They'll go hard on the brakes, their rear tires may lock up, and they try to turn into the corner, and their back end begins to slide around, because at that point, that is all the tires are doing. They're sliding, they are not rolling, so they don't have the grip to be able to follow the front of the car nearly as well. And that's where you see a lot of people getting in trouble when they first start out with sim racing. Now, I mentioned earlier when talking about throttle, about how you can control car balance. And this is one of the ways that you can help to get a car through a corner. You have to think of it like the car is on a scale. Whenever you're on the throttle and you're going down a straight, you have more weight at the back end of the car, at the back end of that scale, pushing it down more and more. And so you're going to have less weight on the front, so the front end of the car won't have the same amount of grip as the rear. And this is what causes understeer. This is part of what makes it much easier for you to begin opening up the steering and power out of a corner quickly, and is part of why your car naturally will pull to the outside of a corner once you get back on throttle. On the opposite end of the spectrum, when you go onto the brakes, similar to what we talked about with the rear brake lock causing the car to rotate, you can get that rotation even without locking up the rear brakes. Because when you go onto the brakes, you can think about it like taking that extra weight off the rear of the scale and putting it on the front. The front of the scale will go down and the rear of the scale will lift up. The same thing is happening with the body and the chassis of the car as you're applying throttle and applying brake. So when you go onto the brake, you're unloading the rear suspension more than it was previously, and you are then taking weight off and making it much easier for it to rotate into a corner. Now, these properties can easily be made use of whenever you're trying to get around a corner. Going into a hard braking zone, you can set up the car to give it extra rotation on brakes. That way, say you're coming up to a hairpin, you go onto the brakes, turn in, and you can get the car to rotate around quicker than it would if those rear tires stayed loaded up and you had to drag the car through the hairpin. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, I know that we said wheel spin is not a good thing and it can cause the car to act unpredictably. However, using a differential, you can lock up the tires to help get more grip and speed out of a corner by causing the freewheel to spin. Okay, quick amendum to what I said. I know that I said a differential will cause a freewheel to spin. This is incorrect. I'm not sure why I made that statement. What I actually meant to say is using a differential, you can lock the tires together. That way your freewheel won't spin as much as it normally would, and it'll allow you to put down more usable power on the track. Anyways, back to the video. Allowing more power to be evenly distributed on track instead of sending a majority of the power through the freewheel, through the open wheel. But what this also means is you can get the wheels to spin up and use that to rotate the car through the exit of a sharp corner such as a hairpin, and then continue getting on the throttle and getting down the straight. Now, when trying this technique, you do not want to go full throttle. You want minimal amounts of throttle. You want just enough to get the car to begin rotating through the corner, but not so much that the car over-rotates and tries to slide. Now, let's move on to different braking techniques. There are two main types of braking techniques. Both come with their own benefits and their own drawbacks. Now, the first and most common type of braking technique that you see people use, especially in modern racing, is what's known as left foot braking. And this is used whenever you're driving a car that does not have a clutch pedal that is used for shifting. Now, the biggest pro to this is going to be you can get a much more even and consistent brake pressure throughout the corner and have a much easier time controlling that brake pressure as you go through different points of the corner. Probably the biggest con of this would go with the biggest pro of the second braking technique, and that is simply experience. Left foot braking is much better when it comes to overall control, speed, and consistency on track due to that greater amount of consistency with your braking pressure. However, it doesn't offer the same experience overall while driving as you would get from the second braking technique, which, moving on to that, is what's known as right foot braking, which is used whenever you are driving any kind of H-gate or non-sequential gearbox. It's a technique that you use whenever you do heel-to-toe braking, and it involves you braking with the right foot while operating the clutch with your left. And it also means that you have to control the throttle with your right foot as well. Generally, this is accomplished by using the ball of your foot to press down on the brake and then you flicking your heel over to give a blip of the gas as you're shifting. Now, the biggest con to right foot braking, especially when you have to do heel to toe downshifting, is going to be your brake pressure. You're going to have a much more sporadic pressure as the action of you flicking your heel over to blip the throttle is going to mean that your right foot is undulating and the pressure is changing around as you are doing that. What this means is you won't get the same consistent and even braking forces that you would if you were left foot braking, and it's possible to accidentally use too much pressure and lock up the brakes just because of the fact that you may wind up applying a little too much pressure while you're trying to do heel to toe. Now, this is something that generally won't become a major issue for you once you have really practiced with the technique and learned how to do it, but for a beginner, it's a very difficult technique to learn and master, and it is something that you may see them having issues with when they're trying to start out. The biggest pro of the right foot braking technique and heel to toe downshifting is the experience. I can say personally there is nothing more fun than taking a classic 4, 5, 6 speed H-gate car and throwing it around the track, all the while using heel to toe downshifting to try and get the car slowed down and into a corner. For me personally, it definitely provides a much more authentic experience and a much more fun experience once you learn to do it. However, it is definitely not the quickest experience to try. Now, the nice thing is on most sims, you can set up your braking controls however you would desire, meaning even if a car does come with any kind of H-gate non-sequential transmission, generally you're able to work it even without needing to use the clutch. So if you prefer just doing left foot braking and don't want to learn right foot braking, you are able to set up the sim so that auto clutch is on and you don't need to worry about it. So you're able to leave that left foot open strictly for the brake pedal. So in summary for this episode, the most important things you can really have at your disposal in any sim or any car is going to be your throttle and brake control. You need to know what kind of car, track, and corner you are on, what kind of grip levels you have in the car, because that will help determine what kind of throttle application you want to be using at any given point. But you always want to make sure that you are using a smooth brake application. That way you can try and avoid brake lock and more easily feel it when the brakes do lock up before you wind up getting into a major accident. Once you learn how to use throttle and brake properly, you can then use it to manipulate the balance of the car mid-corner and use it for encouraging or discouraging rotation through the corner to help you get a better turn in and corner exit. There are two different kinds of braking techniques that you need to keep in mind. You have left foot braking for a sequential gearbox, which will give you a much more consistent brake application and give you much more consistent pressures throughout the corner while not giving you the same authenticity or experience that you might have with older vehicles. And you also have right foot braking or heel to toe braking and downshifting, which will give you more sporadic pressure and is a much more difficult technique to learn than left foot braking. But once you're sitting in older cars, pushing them around a track, gives you a much more enjoyable, much more authentic experience, at least in my opinion. Well, guys, this has been it for episode 3 of Learning Sim Racing. Again, this episode has been all about throttle and brake control and different braking techniques that you can use out on track. I am always looking for ideas of topics that we can cover in this series, and I plan to continue making videos on it until we run out of topics that can be covered. So if you have any ideas on what can be thrown in, then go ahead and leave those in the comments below, guys, and I will see you in the next episode.
What is reflected in my eyes? Another moonlight in a starless midnight. The showers on the people passing by. One is so small and the world's so wide.